Hello everyone. Nice to see a full house. Welcome to this Rhodes Centre for Economics and Finance talk by Dani Rodrik. Obviously you're here to see him, not me, hence the turnout, which is nice. So a little bit of background on personally. I don't know if you actually recall this or not. Do you remember the first time we met? No, doesn't. See, because I was a graduate student and he was already a professor. You were in DEPA at SEPA in your office, and I was a friend of Sarah Cliff's. See, doesn't remember this at all. And back then, Dani wrote a book called Has Globalization Gone Too Far? In 1996. Talk about being ahead of the curve. And at that point in time, I remember sort of the think tank Twitterati, before Twitter ever existed, to the extent that it was a think tank Twitterati in DC, was scandalized by the very notion that this eminent economist, or at least on his way to being eminent, had said that globalization might have gone too far. Well, 20 years later, it seems that millions of people around the world might have the idea that maybe Dani had a point. Maybe it has gone too far. So in exploring these issues, I thought no one's better than going back to the source. So I'd like to present to you Dani Rodrik, Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government.
Thank you very much, Mark, for inviting me here. Not so much for putting me on the spot, but I assure you that my forgetfulness is completely equal opportunity at my age, so that it's many things I don't remember, increasingly so. I guess the plan here is that I'm going to be talking maybe for about 20 minutes or so. And then we'll have a discussion, and we'll probe some of these questions a little bit more, and sort of open it up to questions as well. These days I like to begin by going back in history to what was effectively the first self-consciously populist movement, and that, of course, is the U.S. populists back in the late 19th century. Those of you who are Americans probably know this particular speech. It's one of the, if not the most famous piece of political oratory in U.S. political history. William Jennings Bryan in the 1896 Democratic Congress, where he rails against the gold standard, and this is how the speech ends, that you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, this famous sentence. Of course, he's talking about the gold standard and pitting sort of the people, mankind, sort of the ordinary people, against the requirements of the gold standard. Of course, the gold standard was the globalization of the time. And the grievances, in fact, were very similar to today's grievances, which was essentially that the rules of the gold standard necessitated what today we would call, especially in the European context, politics of austerity, that they implied essentially tight money, high real interest rates, and therefore a crushing burden of debt on farmers in the southern and western parts of the United States, which is why these farmers' alliances that led to the populist movement, the People's Party in the United States, grew out of. And of course, the target was, in the abstract, the gold standard, but in a much more concrete fashion, it was the corporate and financial interests in New York and the northeastern part of the United States. So this was really what today we would call a kind of a left-wing variant of populism, in the sense that it took aim at big business, but sort of the rules of the globalization at the time was very much there. So this is the first but not the last time we see a kind of close relationship between the advanced stages of globalization. At the time, the advanced stages of a kind of the gold standard and a kind of a populist backlash. So this is something that has been historically repeating itself. Now, there's a term that I want to be clear about because I think conceptually it allows me to make some of my points. So I'm going to use this term hyperglobalization, and I want to be clear what I mean by that. So hyperglobalization is an abstract notion that refers to a kind of world economy that is as integrated as a domestic national economy would be. So essentially a world where national economic borders have no depressing effects on international trade or international investment or international economics. So under what conditions would you get such a hyper-globalized world economy? Of course, so this is the definition: full economic integration or the absence of transactions cost. So the implication for policy at the level of nation states would be that you obviously cannot impose any restrictions at the border. Furthermore, since differences in monetary, legal, regulatory arrangements essentially create discontinuities at the border and therefore raise the cost of doing business across different national settings, these also must be harmonized away. So think about why you need a common money or single money. It's because having two different monies involve an exchange rate that is fluctuating causes a transactions cost because of the uncertainty, and therefore single money is what you need to get to go beyond the benefits of simply removing barriers at the border. And that, of course, was essentially the argument for single money in the European context, to have a more perfect economic union. But beyond that, the third level, if you will, in some sense, the most demanding level, is that you also must credibly commit to not deviating from these harmonized monetary, legal, jurisdictional arrangements. And in the context of money, for example, it's not enough to have a fixed currency, because even with a fixed exchange rate, well, you can change that exchange rate. So you go to actually a single currency, which is an irrevocable tying of your hands. And that's why the euro, for example, has no escape clause. You can't leave the euro. There's nothing. So if there was such an opt-out clause once you're in, it would, it would reduce the level of integration that's so desired. So I think in some sense, I don't think we have hyper-globalization anywhere in the world, but probably the Eurozone is sort of where it is the example where it is the most advanced, or where we get closest. And I'll get back to the Eurozone in a little bit. So I think what I would say is that we, after the 1990s, we've pursued a kind of globalization model that has moved us closer to hyper-globalization. So again, caricaturing somewhat, I'd like to say that the pre-1990 model of globalization was actually very different than the post-1990 model. And the pre-1990 model was essentially focused on simply tackling restrictions at the border, import tariffs, import quotas, not going beyond the border. The pre-1990 model also explicitly acknowledged the need to manage capital flows. So capital account management, capital controls were explicitly part of this regime. Essentially there was a lot of room for each country to pursue its own set of regulatory arrangements or its own national developmental model. I think increasingly after the 1990s and with the onset of the World Trade Organization, and even more so with a bunch of regional trade agreements since then, or with the onset of financial globalization, I think that the nature of globalization changed significantly, and in some ways that kind of hyper-globalization that I sketched out before became much more of a target, never quite reaching there, but it became kind of an objective that increasingly trade agreements began to be about tackling so-called restrictions behind the border, whether there was industrial policies or subsidies on intellectual property rights regimes, state ownership. Increasingly, the exporters, the investors, the firms and banks became the new agenda setters. And to a much greater extent, I think this was an approach where rather than maximizing the policy space for each country, subject to the constraint that there be thriving international trade and investment, the priorities were reversed. And it became much more pursuing globalization for its own, as an end on its own. Now, I think the reason that I've sort of spent some time trying to talking about hyperglobalization per se is really to talk about this trilemma, which I think helps us see how globalization has evolved over time. And what this trilemma, which I call the political trilemma of the world economy, says that if you think about these three things in those boxes, hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, and mass politics, that you cannot have all three of those things at the same time, that you can have at most two out of the three, okay? So fundamentally, I think the trilemma is the consequence of a number of basic building blocks, I think none of which is particularly controversial. One is that sort of markets actually are not, self-standing, self-creating institutions that need to be embedded in stabilizing, regulating, and legitimizing institutions. So markets are needed. Markets need these institutions. That there are multiple ways of constructing those institutions so that there is not a one-to-one mapping between well-functioning market and the form that these regulatory arrangements might take. So different countries might choose different types of welfare state arrangements, different types of regulating financial markets, different taxation systems. Third, that in democracies, these choices as to how you will design these regulatory arrangements or these market-supporting institutional arrangements must reflect the electorate's preferences. Fourth, that it's precisely these differences in national institutional arrangements or in national regulations that are part of the cross-border transactions costs that keep hyperglobalization restricted, okay? And therefore, sort of when you put those four ideas together, is where you get the trilemma. The trilemma is the implication of these four things. So I'll talk a little bit about I'll take you through the trilemma during the course of history. But I want to just be clear about to the extent that I'll be drawing attention between democracy and globalization, I also want to be, or hyperglobalization, I want to be very explicit about where I see the fundamental tension to be. Now, often this tension is presented by saying that essentially, building a global market requires global rules, and those global rules are necessarily going to constrain domestic policy space. That on its own is not undemocratic because democracies often delegate to autonomous agencies, whether it's domestic autonomous agencies or international agreements, certain prerogatives in order to actually make their functioning, and in order to improve their functioning. So just because a democracy delegates some sovereignty or some area of policy to another agency doesn't necessarily mean that this act of delegation and therefore the policy constraint that implies is undemocratic. And as political theorists and international relations scholars have made clear, that such constraints can actually enhance the performance of democracies. They can do so by limiting the power of special interests, by enhancing the quality of democratic deliberation. But the problem, of course, is that such constraints need not do so. And the issue is, when can we distinguish constraints that satisfy the requirements of democratic delegation and constraints that do not? Very crudely speaking, I think one way of making that distinguishing is to distinguish instances where these global rules or the policy constraints are designed to address genuine problems of democratic polities, such as commitment and time inconsistency, these are cases where a majority want to restrain its actions in the future because its actions in the future might harm itself today. So this classic example is the conduct of monetary policy that in the short run you may want to inflate to get the short-run benefits of higher inflation today by printing more money. In the long run, you know that all that is going to get you is higher inflation and therefore is not going to be helpful. So you're better off committing yourself or delegating power to an independent central agent, to an independent central bank that can keep inflation low and therefore protect you from your own, the democratic polity, from your worst instincts. So that's the kind of, canonical case of democratic delegation. But the other cases are, in fact, where delegation occurs in contexts where the policy constraints are effectively purchased by a certain group to constrain other groups in society. So they're fundamentally redistributive in nature. It's the result of a temporary majority essentially undermining the interests of another group in society and the social contracts that go alongside that. And these are fundamentally, from a normative standpoint, are much less defensible from a democratic standpoint, because what you're doing by through entering into international trade agreements or buying into financial globalization is you're simply leveraging the international domain to enhance your power vis-a-vis other domestic contenders at home, with no necessary implication for the quality of the functioning of democracy as a result. Okay? So that's where I think the tension exists. So let me go back to this trilemma. I think the best way to think about this is to really run the trilemma through economic history, going back to the first era of globalization, sort of the gold standard that I've talked about before. So in some sense, the gold standard model was precisely one where you had combined high level of globalization, certainly with respect to free flow of capital, with a system where essentially it was up to national sovereigns to enforce the rules of the global standard, enforce the property rights and the contracts and the free flow of capital across national boundaries. And that's sort of the model of golden straitjacket. Why is it a model of golden straitjacket? Because essentially the national sovereign, the only economic policy that was permissible for the national sovereign were those policies that were compatible with the peg to the gold and with free capital mobility. Everything else was outside the possibility. In a way, in the late 19th century, this really didn't bind so much because, the populists and others, notwithstanding, there wasn't much of a conception of a national economic management. So the issue of regulating business or the issue of stabilizing the macroeconomy through Keynesian policies, those hadn't become part of the policy mainstream the way that they were going to be. But because this model constrains the sovereign to act in ways that only enforce the rules of the open global economy, it also means that the sovereign cannot be responsive to what sort of the populace or the democracy at large, or what mass politics might demand. So there's Tom Friedman's has a nice analogy here, which is sort of that when you don the golden straitjacket, your economy shrinks, but your economy grows and your politics shrinks. And in particular, politics becomes a choice between Coke and Pepsi, and no local flavors are allowed. So that what means that the kind of diversity of different types of institutional arrangement or policies you can follow are necessarily restricted, because anything else you do either might scare away capital or might conflict with the rules of the open economy. But of course this was a possible set of arrangements only in a kind of context where the sovereign was insulated from mass political pressure. But once the labor movement got organized, once mass media became a way that an independent source of pressure, once the franchise was extended and sort of more democratic means of participation became established, ultimately this model became unsustainable precisely because of the conflict between mass politics and the golden straitjacket. Now, Keynes, who had lived through that period and had witnessed the collapse of the gold standard in Britain in 1931, precisely because what mass politics demanded, which was sort of inflating the economy and lower interest rates in the late 1920s, early 1930s, conflicted with what the gold standard required, which was high interest rate policies to maintain the peg to the gold. His design in the immediate post-war period was one that was very different. In fact, his image, his vision, was that given sort of advanced political economy of the societies of his time, that it was globalization that had to be kept at bay, that the only way you could combine mass politics with national sovereignty was, in fact, to opt for a model that was explicitly less hyper-globalist. So that meant that, for example, as he put it at the time, capital controls were going to be not just a temporary expedient, but they were actually a permanent feature of the post-war regime, the way that Keynes saw it, because capital controls would open up space for national economic stabilization and the responsiveness of national monetary and fiscal policies to domestic economic needs, as opposed to the requirements of the international economy. In the trade sphere, a very similar process worked out, where the general agreement on tariffs and trade ended up being an organization with very shallow ambition that didn't go much beyond simply eliminating quantitative restrictions and reducing import tariffs in ways that I briefly sketched out at the beginning, and was actually consistent with leaving significant amount of open policy space for different countries to construct their own welfare state regimes, to conduct their own industrial policies, and so on. So this was explicitly an incomplete model of globalization. Now, there is in principle, a third possibility here, and that's sort of to basically say, let's give up the nation state, and what's so, important about that. So in principle, there is a kind of a third alternative, which is a kind of a global governance alternative. And much of the sort of discussion among sort of policy elites before 2016 sort of revolved around some version of this, except that, those elites would never be so honest as to admit that what they wanted, the path on which they were moving, which was to construct this model of global governance, necessarily meant that national sovereignty would be eroded and that would be undermined, because that would not have been a very politically popular argument. But that's, in principle, a third possibility, and we might discuss whether this is still on the table or not, or how this compares to the others. I'll end just by bringing up the European version of this trilemma, because in many ways Europe lives through this trilemma in a very real, concrete fashion, because Europe has, especially the Eurozone, has gone much further than any other part of the world in the direction of hyperglobalization regionally. It is living through this trilemma in a much more concrete fashion. And I think the European version of this is that between European single market, including European Monetary Union, and national sovereignty and mass politics, again, only 2 out of those 3 can be had together. And so when you think about what that implies for the future of Europe, it essentially implies that, assuming that you don't want to give up on democracy, that either politics has to expand, so you have to move in the direction of fiscal and political union, or economic union has to take a step back. which is sort of the Brexit, the Eurozone, or sort of multiple clubs within the Eurozone, Europe kind of an idea, but you're basically stepping back. So either politics meets economics at the regional level, or economics has to recede to somewhat closer to where politics currently is, which is at the national level. And I think sort of sometimes I've heard the discussion that the reason that populists are winning in Europe is precisely that you know, in some sense they've been the only ones that are honest about the trilemma by saying that that you can't have all these three things simultaneously, and on top they have been very explicit about which they're happy to give up. They're happy to give up the European single market. So they're very explicit about their choices and where they are. Whereas I think the political center in Europe has never been explicit about sort of where it wants to end up. And we can also talk about why and so on. But let me just stop here. I've sort of been relatively general about sort of, but I think I find this is kind of a useful framework to talk about some of the trade-offs and the challenges we face. And in the discussion, we may talk a little bit more about more directly about the populist reaction and where we go from here. So let me just stop here.
Thank you very much for that, Dani. Now, if you're a regular attendee of the Rhodes events, you will, of course, know that this is Brendan Greeley from the Financial Times. And Brendan has a unique talent. He's even better at asking questions than me, which is why I bring him along to ask people questions. No bar is too high, Brendan. There we go.
I was just going to say that
yes.
The first thing that happens whenever anybody says you're good at anything is that you immediately state that.
Absolutely. Right. Thereby maintaining my perfect reputation. I'm going to basically step out and listen to this, and then I'm going to be wandering around with two mics. And when we open up for the Q&A, I'm basically the person with the mic. So that's my role in this one. I'm outsourcing essentially all of this.
How much time do we have before I stop talking?
You're at 4:30. Why not give it 20? Give it full 20, and then we'll go from there.
All right. So, as Mark already pointed out, I'm a journalist. It's my job not to know anything. I have to go to people like Dani if I want to know something. And I wanted to take a second to frame why it is that the way he thinks and the way he talks is so incredibly important right now, and why it's so rare, and why we need to see more of it from economists to help us in politics. Economics has a transmission problem. Central bankers talk about how certain policies, they have to figure out whether they actually transmit to the real economy, whether they have the desired effects. And I think that economists live by certain social rules that they think are legal rules, but are just sort of encoded into the way they talk among themselves. One is stay within your lane, stay within your discipline. One of them is speak your own language. You won't get in trouble with your peer reviewers. And the third is do not, under any circumstances, become an advocate, because you can only get in trouble when you do that. And so because of this, I witnessed this quarterly conversation where some poor journalist, sometimes me, writes a piece that says economics is broken. Models are broken. They don't account for real human behavior, and so the profession doesn't work. And then I go and I read on Twitter how the economists respond. And the response always goes like this. Ha ha, journalists don't know anything. Of course, we've been doing amazing work on heterogeneity and macroeconomic modeling. Don't you guys see that? And the answer is no. No, we do not. Because nobody knows that heterogeneity means that people are different. It's very, and so this is frustrating to me, because if you know how to read the code, you know that if you take that example, heterogeneity and macroeconomic modeling, you know that the IMF apologized in a very coded way inside a global policy brief for what it did to Greece. They apologized, and they did this by introducing a model that accounted for the fact that different people respond differently to austerity. But you can't see this unless you belong to this club, which has its own social rules. The reason I appreciate Dani Rodrik, and the reason we need more of him to help us figure out how to make decisions, is that he does not stay in his lane. He speaks our language. And he's not afraid of becoming an advocate, which is something that we appreciate. So you helped frame something for me when you talked about the idea of barbarians, and that one reason that economists are sometimes afraid to speak plainly to journalists is that you're worried about the wrong kind of barbarian. Help us understand this.
Well, this actually goes back to 1997 when Mark mentioned that I published this little monograph called "Has Globalization Gone Too Far?" And this 1997, of course, is the height of sort of globalization mania. And I express a number of concerns about what globalization might be doing to social fissures and distributional issues within countries, and further that that might have some political consequences. Of course, at the time, it wasn't populist yet, but there was already Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan and Le Pen, the father. So you could see some signs of that already. So this was what arguments that by now I think have become perfectly commonplace. So I sent, before the book got published, I sent it to a very distinguished economist who would subsequently, win the Nobel Prize, and he came and I asked him, basically to ask him if he would like to write a little blurb for the book, for the monograph, and he came back to me and he said, "Look, this all sounds quite interesting and relevant, but don't you think it will give ammunition to the barbarians?"
Oh my God.
And since then, so this has been the term that I use, and which actually encapsulates, I think, what the sort of a kind of a typical concern. And it still happens to me that I give a talk like this, and there'll be an economist who will raise his or her hand and say, "But don't you understand that by sort of you're fueling the populists when you're raising questions like this or raising sort of concerns?" And so I've thought a lot about this. So why is it that what elicits this kind of a response? And I think it's linked to a couple of things. For whatever reason, the economists think that the distribution of barbarians is highly skewed, sort of on one side of the norm. So that is to say that you must believe that there are a lot more barbarians on the protectionist side than there are on the globalist side, right? Because otherwise, why would you worry with the protection of barbarians only on the one side? But this is actually sort of there is a kind of a folk political economy among economists that because the notion of comparative advantage and free trade are so valued within the economics profession, and we are the guardians of that we view ourselves necessarily as having to lean against the wind on people on the other side. And I think there was a time when this may not have been a bad model of the underlying politics of countries, when protectionists were really the dominant group in society, and therefore countries were too autarkic. And then, politically, it may have made sense for economists in public to sort of, lean in the direction of more open trade regimes, even if they didn't agree with every single, a paragraph or clause in a trade agreement, because it was sort of moving us broadly in the right direction. But I think by the 1990s, you could see that the process had then been captured by the barbarians on the other side. It was the international investors, big pharma, multinational corporations. I'm saying that they are barbarians in the same sense that I mean, let's say, labor unions are barbarians, which this is not barbarian, this is not barbarism, it's just defending your interests. But that notion that on the whole economists have to militate against barbarians only on one side of the argument is still one that I think is quite pervasive among economists. And my response usually is, look, there are barbarians on both sides of this issue, and when economists have been cheerleaders for the kind of trade agreements that have pushed for more monopoly rents for big pharmaceutical companies, or for sort of highly unequal agreements that provide special legal privileges for international investors or multinational corporations, they have essentially allied themselves with a different group of barbarians that are no less self-interested than those on the other side. So I think this is something that I've been trying to argue against. I don't know with what degree of success, but that's sort of the barbarian issue.
Well, you've also been speaking, you've been writing to both kinds of barbarians. One of the things that I think is interesting about your work is that you've pointed out that workers need to rediscover the nation state in a healthy way. Is that the workers of the world will not necessarily unite, even though they might have the same goals, and that the way to safeguard those goals is within the nation state, where you have democracy and you have institutions that can safeguard, the things that you hold dear. What I think is interesting when you point that out is that you've also said that capital needs to rediscover a kind of healthy nationalism, a kind of patriotism. What are the obligations of those other barbarians that you talk about?
Well, I mean, as I said in my comments here, well-functioning markets on which employers and firms and capitalists rely have a whole range of institutional requirements. Those are things like, a good legal system that's going to enforce property rights and contracts, a stable monetary regime, a police force and a judiciary that's going to keep the pirates and the bandits and the thieves at bay, an intellectual property rights regime that will ensure that those who come up with innovations can earn a stream of profits out of them, and ultimately a kind of a legitimizing apparatus that keeps society happy with what's happening, because otherwise they'll be up with their pitchforks so all of these institutions on which corporations rely, and a lot more, including the public infrastructure in transport and communications, all the infrastructure in terms of education, funding of R&D, and all of that. All of those, the infrastructure is provided, by and large, by the nation state. When times are good, and things seem to be moving on their own, you don't see that apparatus very transparently in place. So I think when the economy is booming, corporations sort of imagine as if they live in a world where they don't need their nation state, their government, or their societies, their local communities, because they're part of this global market, and it seems to operate on its own. When the crisis strikes, that's when they realize that they need their domestic legal system, they need their domestic bankruptcy procedure, they need a domestic monetary and fiscal authority to create demand for them, they need the government to bail them out, and then they sort of things stabilize and they forget all of that. Given that we live in a politically divided world, this is part of the essential quid pro quo, it seems to me, that we need to revive, not necessarily in the form that it existed back in the 50s or 60s, because the world has changed, but the essence of it is the same, that corporations have responsibilities towards their local communities, toward their local workforce, toward their local suppliers, and they have a responsibility to disseminate the know-how and the management and the technology they have to the rest of society. Yes, we live in a much more international economy. That doesn't mean disengaging from the international economy, but they have to be rooted. There has to be a certain rootedness to their behavior, in exactly the same way that the political establishment essentially has to pursue the national interest, because they're elected to be responsive to the domestic electorate, and so there's nothing wrong with domestic politicians pursuing the national interest, however that is defined. But you can't have a system, and I think that's partly the dichotomy. You can't have a system where the corporations believe that they're part of this, seamless world market, and where they have no responsibility to their local societies. They don't rely on any national governments, but that political decision-making accountability is still based at the level of nation states. That's a recipe for trouble, and I think in many ways the populist backlash is a reflection of that fragility.
I think another thing that comes out of everything that you write is that ideas matter. Is that we can talk about incentives, and it's very good for cynical journalists to look at incentives, but people genuinely believe things, and they act on those beliefs. one of the things, for example, that drives, you know, what you're talking about, I've been trying to make the phrase Abramovichification a thing, where you get to make your money in one country and then pay your taxes in another country and then go buy a successful football team and have a good life in a third country. But it's, you know, it takes 20 years for an idea to be generated and then actually turn into a political movement. And one of the things we talked about earlier was, you know, the inability of the center-left parties in Germany, in the UK, in the US to respond to this moment that we have, even a decade after the crisis. Why was it? Why were they so ill-served with ideas when the time came and they needed them?
I mean, I think two things. I mean, one is that I think the progressive part of the economics establishment, or the central left, you know, has not been necessarily as good as the original neoliberals in packaging their ideas in a way that seemed powerful and powerfully communicated to a large number of people.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. That's incredibly important what you just said, because it's the packages that arrive at my door as a journalist, and the packages that come from the right are much better presented. They've got better fonts. They've got better graphic artists. They're more responsive. They're so good at packaging ideas.
I mean, there was I think the notion that Hayek and Friedman and sort of were able to communicate that markets are freedom and markets are prosperity at the same time. I mean, those were very, very powerful ideas, and that that captured the imagination. And they came at the time when, there was apparent failures in the pre-existing consensus, that Keynesianism didn't seem to work as well in the 70s after the oil shock, that the welfare state seemed to be sort of overextended itself, that top marginal tax rates had grown too high. I mean, all of these things were debatable and presumably also reformable, but I think the manner in which they were used by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan was very effective, and we're still very much under the influence of those ideas. And so the one thing is that the left has not had this, for some reason. I'm trying to sell the notion of inclusive prosperity, sort of for some reason it doesn't go as far. And we'll see, but it may be it's a question of time. So one part of it is that there hasn't been this alternative packaging so far. The other part is that the parties of the left, if you go back to the 1990s, where the sort of New Democrats under Clinton in the U.S., New Labour under Blair in the UK, Schroeder in Germany, all central-left parties and movements essentially incorporated in large part, that neoliberal conception, and their main contribution to it, became what my co-teacher and colleague at Harvard, Robert Unger, calls sort of the sweetening it at the margin. So, you basically take the whole thing, but you say, yeah, but we'll take the edge off of that kind of market society by, doing a lot better on compensation, better on safety nets. So no real imagination, simply sort of some sweetening at the margin of the distributional conflicts that might be created as a result. And therefore, when I think 2016 comes, I think those central-left parties, I think, are tarred with a kind of a vision, which in many ways was a cheerleader of the old model that they can't now dissociate themselves from. So, Hillary Clinton is tarred by, the 1990s style support of financial globalization, Wall Street, and NAFTA. And even though her policies are very different, come 2016, there's a genuine credibility problem. So I think the second part is that I think we will need not only a new package. I think the underlying ideas are there, but we don't necessarily have the packaging. But also we'll need probably new politicians, new political movements that can, come and present a more credible face to this alternative.
I want to go back to trade and talk about this idea, as you put it, of a sweetener. which is that, there was this idea in the late 90s that trade is good. We can just do it unilaterally if we have to, open up our markets, everything's going to be fine. And then there's an idea looking back now at the China shock, at what happened after China opened up its markets and we opened up our markets to China, that there should have been sweeteners, that we should have done a better job of helping some towns adjust. I think that seems to be where the discussion is right now. If I understand correctly, one of the things that you're saying is sweeteners aren't enough. There needs to be a fundamental reconception in the way we think about international trade. Is that right?
And the domestic economy too. I think that's right. I mean, I think, the welfare state, was a, incredible innovation, and I think the welfare state gave capitalism several more decades of life, and good thing too. But I think we're now at a stage where it's not by sort of reforming the welfare state that we are going to move on, I think, to the next stage. I think the next stage has got to be much more of a productivist approach. And let me explain what I mean by productivist. The usual approach to removing the inequalities and insecurities associated with market capitalism, and the answer that the welfare state brought to it was by we let the market work and then we redistribute after the fact. We might also intervene a little bit before the market gets into the action by investing in education. So here is where production takes place. This is all the education and initial endowments that people bring to the market. And then after the production takes place, we redistribute income through the tax transfer scheme. But our interventions are basically mostly on this side, at the very end, the tax and transfer, and some also investing in education. So neither of those tools are adequate anymore. On education, because technology is moving way too rapidly and much of the learning is actually taking place within firms, and much of the inequality is actually generated by inequalities among firms and not because of inequalities in access to education. And the tax and transfer, I think we've reached the limits of that for a variety of other reasons. So the intervention has got to be much more in this production stage. And what does that mean? It means basically dealing with firms as repositories and disseminators of knowledge and management and new techniques, and partnering with them so that they essentially are a source of generating equality within society rather than inequality. So what that means is, going back to this notion of responsibility, is that the winners are essentially responsible for expanding the winner's circle. Part of the quid pro quo is that the government is there to provide all the supports they need, whether it's skilled workers or the appropriate financial regulations or intellectual property rights. But in return, those firms have a responsibility to disseminate their techniques and skill up their sort of a larger labor force, provide for appropriate employment conditions, train and expand their circles of suppliers, so disseminate these technologies backward. So it's a complex of engagements where the firm is much more embedded in the rest of society through these kinds of links. And I think this already happens in a number of different areas. For example, in the US, this happens already at the very innovative, high-tech, most R&D intensive parts of the US economy, where the US DARPA agency is intimately involved with the universities and with entrepreneurs and with the high-tech firms in developing new technologies. And that model is very much a model like this, where there's a intense partnership between the government as funder, as innovator, as incubator, and the private sector as buys into this, but then sort of makes these knowledge more broadly available. But that, I think, has to move much further back into the, sort of a lot of the production stage as well.
The Democratic Party is running right now on Medicare for all, and it should be running on DARPA for all.
You know, that's not a bad slogan.
Bumper sticker, we have it.
At all. I might adopt it.
All right, Mark's got the microphone, and he's the microphone meister. So if you have a question,
So who
make a
wants to go
motion.
first? I think it's Jeff.
Danny, I'm Jeff Colgan. I'm professor of political science here at the Watson Institute. Thank you for a great talk. Well, wonderful to have you here. I want to ask you about capital account mobility. At the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned in the kind of pre-1990s world that there were capital account management and there was restrictions. And so the question is, what, if any, restrictions you would support on capital mobility? And the sort of connection to this is, to what extent would that address a global race to the bottom on corporate and capital gains taxation?
I think we need to reverse the norm, which has happened a little bit, but not as much as I would like to see. The norm that, you know, open capital account is ultimately what every country has to move to, but that, you know, maybe they'll move slowly, or that. So as you know, the IMF's view on this actually has changed quite a bit. So in that I think this is one of the things that has happened since the crisis. The IMF, which in the late 1990s was very actively pursuing the norm of free capital mobility for all countries, essentially has stepped back. It's another sort of one of these, we acknowledge our mistakes, but not so in so many words, was basically said that, you know, capital controls might be, you know, okay under certain circumstances. So it's still with all those caveats that it's the last resort and blah, blah, blah. But at least, you know, sort of the ideas have changed. I would go much further on that. I would say that there's no, not necessarily, we should not view capital mobility. In fact, I would say that, you know, that our presumption should be capital should be no more or no less mobile than labor. You know, that fundamental asymmetry is never makes sense from an economic standpoint. At the margin, the gains from improving labor mobility for economic purposes are vastly greater than improving the framework for capital mobility today. So if there's one margin that we ought to be work on is the labor mobility margin, not at all the capital mobility one. So I think that we will need to go back. But on the issue of a race to the bottom of corporate taxation, you know, I think, you know, Gabriel Zucman has made the argument, and I think it's a very powerful one, that capital mobility does not require a downward race to the bottom in corporate taxation, because in principle, every country unilaterally can change its tax regime to one where every corporation is liable to pay a corporate tax that apportions its global profits on the basis of its sales in the domestic market. So when you think that through, every country can do that, and you actually don't need any coordination. It doesn't matter at all what corporate taxes, how low they are in the rest of the world. All you need is what are your global profits, and that's pretty well known, and what's percentage of the sales accrue in the domestic market. Those are things that are very difficult to fudge, and it does then, corporations don't have any incentive to move either physical or paper capital or anywhere else, and you can get as much corporate, you can save your corporate tax revenue in this way. You don't need to wait for other countries to do this. So that's actually one of the most important ideas around for reforming the tax regime, and it doesn't depend on international tax coordination. Now, for wealthy individuals, it's different. Because for wealthy individuals, because you don't see their income, it's not directly observable, there you need much more international tax coordination, like having a kind of a global registry of bank accounts and things like that, so you know who has money where. But corporations that are public, you know exactly what their profits are, and you know exactly how much they're selling, so you could apply that for corporate taxation.
Professor, I'm intrigued that you started your story in the 1890s because Brian is reacting not only to the great political crisis of the United States during the 1890s, but he's also reacting in a sense to America's changing place in the world, because the 1890s is also when the United States becomes in a sense a world power. In 1900, he fights his election not on free silver, but on anti-imperialism. And so the question that arises in my mind as an historian, is American hegemony the prerequisite for this process of hyperglobalization that you've described? Because certainly in Europe, I mean, I don't need to tell you, there is no European project as we understand it without American victory in the Second World War and in the Cold War. And therefore, if we're seeing an ebbing of American hegemony and American primacy, do we even need to worry about hyperglobalization in the future?
Yeah, good question. I mean, you know, in some sense, I mean, the hyperglobalization, you know, always, you know, requires one of two things, and in practice, one of them is much more likely, which is why you get, you know, advanced stages of globalization associated with hegemony. And, you know, sort of hyperglobalization requires a global set of rules. And then the question is, who writes those global rules? So those global rules can be written either by the hegemon, or they can be written, you know, cooperatively with countries agreeing on what the common rules ought to be. Now, the second is much harder, and when we try the second, we get very thin, non-binding set of rules, precisely because so many countries have so many different interests. But when you have a hegemon who can actually write the rules, so that's sort of Britain in the classical gold standard, or if you will, you know, the United States, especially after 1990 with its triumphalism. So I think it's really post-1990, sort of, you know, fall of the Berlin Wall, and, you know, the triumphalism of these ideas, where I think, if anything, just when the United States actually is in some sense becoming less important, but effectively, you know, becomes more hegemonic in terms of its setting of the global rules. So then you get this, or for the in the case of the European Union, the hegemonic role of Germany. So effectively, it's Germany who writes the monetary rules, and by and large, it's France and Germany that are writing sort of the rest of the rules. So there too, you see the hegemonic the presence. So I think, yes, there is a kind of a you know, sort of a plausible correlation with the presence of hyperglobalization and the presence of a hegemon behind the scenes, and that explains sort of, you know, how it can be sustained for a while, because the hegemon is perfectly happy with the rules, because the only one who's not much bound by the rules is the hegemon, because it's the hegemon who's written the rules. So and to carry the story, I'm sorry, a little bit further. So then, what happens when the rules come to bite the hegemon is when, you know, this today's experience with the United States, right? The United States no longer wants to live by those rules because it's become so much weaker in that way.
Got to, well, I want to go over here because it's nice to change the geography of the room a little bit.
But all the questions will be coming from one side.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and I think I want to piggyback to his point, but more so in a way of awareness of not getting to the globalization, because if the globalization in itself is already a problem, why do we want to elevate it to the next level? And the other point is, globalization only benefits the corporation that is globalizing to some degree, and it allows for low wages in the country where they go. It allows for a lot of rules that will not be allowed in the land of the corporation, let's say the United States. So a lot of rules that are not allowed here will be allowed in other countries. So what is the ethic violation in there, if there is any?
So, I mean, I think you're very right. I mean, I think, you know, globalization becomes particularly problematic where it provides a kind of institutional or regulatory arbitrage that entails a kind of social dumping, if you will, that when workers in the United States are essentially told that they have to compete with workers in Vietnam who don't have labor and collective bargaining rights, and they may not have in the U.S. either, but assuming that they do. That is, effectively sort of is telling them that, if you don't compete in some sense like, those workers in the, if you don't sacrifice some of your hard-won rights, then, the response is going to be outsourcing. The company is going to move somewhere else. So I've long argued that, that certain kinds of trade, particularly trade that is based on well-defined notions of social dumping, in parallel with the argument against regular anti-dumping, which is selling below cost, that there should be safeguards in the international trade regime where countries can actually protect themselves from social dumping, and that's perfectly legitimate. And that would be trade expanding, not trade restricting, in the extent that it increases the legitimacy of the trade system. So I'm with you on that. But we have to be very careful with a number of things, that we are very clear at delineating exactly what social dumping is and it's not. So a country, Vietnam, might have low wages because workers in Vietnam don't have collective bargaining rights, and therefore they get a much lower share of the enterprise surplus. That's social dumping, and that's not legitimate. Workers in Vietnam may have very low wages because their opportunity cost might be very low, or their productivity might be very low. That's a very different kind of competition. I don't think you want to rule out trade on the basis of differences in labor costs that are related much more directly to fundamental sources of comparative advantage. So I think it's that kind of globalization is the globalization we should pursue and we should have. And when the defenders of globalization say, look, it's thanks to globalization that hundreds of millions of workers in East Asia and China have been able to lift themselves out of poverty, there's a lot of truth to that statement, because trade actually has allowed China and other East Asian countries to increase economic opportunities and increase wages. Where they go wrong is that they don't acknowledge that this has been possible because countries like China have played the globalization rules not by sort of post-1990 hyper-globalization WTO rules, but they have played it essentially by Bretton Woods rules, where they've engaged in a wide range of industrial policies. They've managed their capital flows. They've managed their currency. So effectively, they've sort of played globalization according to their own drummer, which was the old model of globalization, which I find much more appealing, in fact.
I'm Selim Sazak. I'm a PhD here. It's great having you here. I was really struck by your faith in firms as part of the solution. You're Turkish, as am I. You were one of the first people to criticize President Erdogan in the late 2000s in his pivot to authoritarianism. It wasn't until a decade later that international business soured on President Erdogan because the business ship wasn't afloat anymore. The big tech companies, the multinational corporations, they have a history and a current trend of pandering to strongmen everywhere from Rwanda, Saudi Arabia, China, so long as the ship is afloat. So what I hear as an undertone in your lecture is that firms need to develop a political consciousness that requires them to think about liberty and rights beyond the bare minimum of market functionality. Is that the case? And if that's the case, how is it ever going to happen? Thank you.
Tough question. Okay, no, not about liberty and rights per se, but about sort of the domain of economic decisions and sort of where do they invest, what do they invest, their relationship with their supplier, their relationship with local community, their relationship with workers and training. So it's a different domain than sort of having views about how political systems ought to operate and so forth. But still, the essence of your question remains, because a critic very easily would say that the system that I've described is what's otherwise known as goes by the name of cronyism or corruption, because what I'm describing is a kind of a very close kind of a relationship between the corporations and the state. And when it goes badly, we call it corrupt relationship, cronyism, and so forth. When it goes well, we say that's healthy government-business partnership. And so the question is, is just like every other domain, sort of, how do we have more of the second, less of the first? And I think it's the reason that I think it's especially important for political democracy to be in the back of this is because you have to think about how you would structure this relationship in a way that's going to not just make the firms accountable to their local communities and the state, but also how do you make the bureaucrats accountable ultimately to the electorate or to the legislature. So there's a fair amount of work on this that, wearing a different hat, I've been involved in thinking about sort of design principles for industrial policy or productivist policies, thinking through these mechanisms of both close interaction, but in the context of a kind of accountability. And so, so for example, certain degree of transparency becomes very important. Setting clear goals becomes very important. But to be also frank, I think there's going to be mistakes and things will often go wrong too. But I think the alternative model of simply basically the alternative model of simple principal agent, that you just keep the firms at arm's length and you don't actually engage in trying to elicit information or engage in quid pro quos, I don't think is the right frame for thinking about particularly the kind of technological challenges that we face for the future, given the implications of technologies for labor markets and internal cleavages in societies. But it's not a very I'm not giving you a very satisfactory answer.
Can I hazard a quick answer or an attempt at an answer? CEOs, when you talk to them, are very quick to point to shareholder value as a set of chains that they cannot escape. They have no choice but to do the things they do because they are bound by shareholder value. That's not a law, it's an idea. So I think that very often people who run companies, I talk to a lot of companies all the time, and there's vast differences in the way companies treat workers and the way they treat local authorities. And those are all sets of moral decisions. And I think that one way to begin to address this massive problem that I think you correctly point out, we cannot assume that companies or the people who own companies will act differently, is to take away that idea. Ideas really matter. We can't change the incentives, but people need moral reasoning to justify the things that they want to do in their own self-interest. And the idea of shareholder value itself had to be invented. Companies behaved differently because there were different moral expectations for CEOs in the 50s and the 60s than there were in the 70s and the 80s. And so it's working at the margins. It's very difficult to change the incentives. But if you can chip away at that idea, that you have no obligation to anyone except your shareholders, I think is important.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, thanks for the talk, and I've really found the location of the firm as the arena for addressing inequality fascinating. But how does that translate across countries, given the inequality, the great inequality that exists among countries? The fact that you still have a large number of countries that are primary producers with the wealth being created elsewhere. How does that operate in a situation like that? And is there, firms are not democratic institutions. I don't know that they respond to democracy. So what role for democracy, especially since your perspective on government from this talk seems to be very much regulatory, but not having government at the heart of the production process. Ghana has just discovered oil, for example. What would be your recommendation to Guyana to use this oil in a way that would benefit its people and address issues of inequality?
Well, I mean, a natural resource discovery or discovery of oil is is an opportunity that often, as you know, gets wasted, and so I think we have a fair amount. We know a fair amount about what the good rules of behavior are. We know a lot less about how to organize politics and institutions in a way that's going to make that work over time. But ultimately, of course, what you want to do is ensure that most of the resources are saved rather than spent. So this is intertemporal choice. So you need institutions for saving the bonanza. You need to ensure that that the productive opportunities that bring oil to the ground and all the logistics and other operations don't just become an island and reserved for foreign corporations. So you need to be nimble about how you're going to disseminate some of these productive and investment opportunities on the part of domestic suppliers and domestic producers as well. Very rigid local content kind of policies don't typically work. So it has to be, I think this is where the kind of partnership where I was talking about before really becomes important, that you cooperate rather than imposing very strict ex-ante limits on foreign investors. You basically engage in a dialogue with them, and you find out what needs to be done for you to use more local supplies, to use more local labor, to train more local labor, and have this much more of a kind of a collaborative process rather than simply setting 50% of your inputs and labor will have to be local in 3 years, and those kind of rigid rules typically don't work very well. And then ultimately using the resources also for engaging in what I call sort of cost discovery, that is engaging in economic diversification, investing in a kinds of new industries in a kind of way that using in a venture fund kind of a way, investing it in a whole bunch of new areas where only a few might be successful within the economy, but you need only a few of them to be successful. So I think these resource booms often are an opportunity for setting up quasi-public venture funds. But then the institutional mechanism becomes very important, that it shouldn't be political cronies that run it. So you separate the management from the political accountability. So you appoint professional managers to engage in project selection, monitoring, and so forth, but also make it politically accountable, and that they need to provide periodic accounting of what they're doing and so forth. So all these design principles of how you would manage this, I think are things that we've learned from bitter experience, mostly because they've gone wrong in other settings. But in terms of, I think, going back to what's different in developing countries from the advanced countries, I would actually say a lot less is different today than was true 40, 50 years ago. Because one thing that globalization has done is that in all of these developing countries, including some very low-income countries, it has created a sliver of firms at the most productive level. And this wasn't true 40, 50 years ago, because when you think, poor countries, rich countries, poor almost, of course there was inequality, but you don't have high-class, world frontier firms in the poor countries. Now you do. You do, even in the poorest countries, you have firms that are extremely capable because they're plugged in through global value chains and other networks into global production networks. They're extremely productive. And the main difference between the richest and the poorest is not whether you have these highly productive firms, it's whether the highly productive segment is 30% of the economy or it's really 10% or the 5% of the economy. But the same opportunity there of connecting these firms with the rest of the economy exists also in the developing countries. So the same challenge in very much the same way exists also for those countries, except that it's a somewhat narrower sliver naturally because there are fewer such firms. But otherwise, it's actually, to me, it's quite striking how the central challenge of development and inclusive prosperity has converged in the form that it takes in the rich countries and the poor countries, because the basic dividing line is now within countries, not across countries in a way.
Hi, I'm Dani, a postdoc here. I wanted to ask you, in your role as economist advocate, to be maybe a little more explicit about where in this trilemma we should live. It seems clear that we don't want to live in the golden straitjacket on the left edge. Some of what you've been arguing towards the end and in your responses to the question suggests to me that you see us living at the bottom edge in a marriage between mass politics and national sovereignty. But I have a question along the lines that Patsy asked about that, which is I completely see the appeal of something like inclusive prosperity, what you've been calling inclusive prosperity, for an American coal miner. But I worry that what looks like inclusive prosperity to someone like that looks like exclusive prosperity to someone who's stuck in the fields in India or is anxious to get into Europe or something like that. So how do you think about the demands of global justice on the inclusive prosperity model? And if you think those concerns are fatal, because I think those concerns are actually quite serious, and the third edge of the triangle does a better job, perhaps, of addressing some of those concerns. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the political constituency for that third triangle, because it seems like there's a considerable inequality in the triangle, which is that there are political constituencies for the bottom edge, there are political constituencies for the left edge, but I'm not sure who the political constituency that would advocate the third edge is, aside from a handful of intellectuals.
Yeah, I mean, I believe strongly that that's the dilemma you laid out is a false dilemma. That is that there is actually no practical trade-off between having a world that provides social protection and protection against social dumping for workers in the advanced countries, and therefore is able to maintain adequate living standards and working conditions for workers at the lower end of the income distribution in places like the United States or Western Europe, and a world in which we're able to provide adequate trading opportunities for the poorest in the rest of the world. I don't think the trade-off exists, first empirically, because before China, there was Japan and South Korea and Singapore and Taiwan and Malaysia, and all of these countries grew heavily through export-oriented industrialization models, and that was fundamentally quite compatible with, at the time, trade regimes that operated under the GATT principles. Not only that, that also the progressive increase in protectionism in the advanced countries when trade, for example, from low-income countries in textiles and clothing began to look like they were going to upset social bargains in the advanced countries, and therefore there were carve-outs in the form of the multi-fiber arrangements, which was really increased protectionism. But increased protectionism in the advanced countries that shared the rents with the exporter countries because the quotas were administered by the exporting countries. So it was actually for a trade economist, it was a terrible system. From a political economy standpoint, it was an ingenious solution. I think that actually reconciled. And that's really, the point of, I'm sure many of you are familiar with my colleague John Ruggie's embedded liberalism idea, which I presented largely as a kind of Keynesian compromise. But basically the notion was that, so when, John Ruggie looked at something like the multi-fiber arrangement, what he saw wasn't a derogation from the rules, but he actually saw, sort of protecting the rules. That is to say that the system was never to be a completely open trade regime. The system was always to provide, find a balance between, sufficient scope for trade and investment, but also you buy for legitimacy and support for the regime as is by having these protective mechanisms. So China is a bit of a sui generis case because it was obviously so large, and it's quite possible that if, let's say, the United States had delayed Chinese entry into WTO or had been more gradual, maybe it's possible that China would have gone a little bit less rapidly, but ultimately, it would not have made a huge difference. So I don't think either as an empirical or a conceptual matter, there is, I don't think, this is one of the, I think, biggest delusions that I encounter about progressives have, which is that, oh my God, if we protect our own workers, what will that do to the poor in the rest of the world? Ultimately, 95% of what happens to the poor in the rest of the world is determined by policies there. And if policies in the advanced countries are moderately open, and that's entirely possible to have in a GATT-like thinner version of globalization, where we're at the bottom of that trilemma, it's no country's growth potential is going to be really hampered by too much protectionism or too many restrictions on market access in the rest of the world. So I don't believe there is such a dilemma, unless of course your counterfactual was complete open borders. Every Indian farmer can move to the United States. That would be the most effective development policy ever, right? But I mean that's not the counterfactual we're talking about. I think I worry that the sorry, Mark. I worry that the real counterfactual is we think we worry so much about this dilemma, and that we use basically the excuse of developing country growth through trade as an excuse to try to force a kind of openness on the advanced countries, and then we get the populist backlash, and then we get the senseless protectionism a la Trump, which achieves nothing except for just complete smoke and mirrors and just complete misdirection. And that's far worse, I think, for developing countries than what we could have.
Do you want to finish at 5:30? So this could be the last question, depending on how long Jan's going to make it.
Thank you. Could you talk more about the tariffs and why you think they are not working, they're not what we need, and then about what else would you suggest, especially if we stay on the bottom in the mass politics and national sovereignty side, what other measures do we have to protect our economies, but do it smart, to create technologies, but not in a way that we harm other countries? So what is kind of the kind of measures that you would suggest?
You're talking about Trump's tariffs? Well, I mean, let's take the U.S. relationship with China. I think first of all, it's no matter how much you raise protection right now in the U.S., it's very unlikely that you're going to be bringing many of those jobs back in the U.S. because of production chains have already developed. The technology has become much more skill biased and much less labor absorbing. So it's very difficult to really envisage that trade protection or tariffs will bring many of those jobs back. So as an simply job increasing measure, I don't think they pass the test. They will have distributional implications in reverse. So some firms will gain, some firms will lose. Workers who work in those gaining firms will be better off. Workers who are working downstream in tariff-ridden industries will be affected badly, and so forth. But so the question, to the extent that these tariffs are addressed, so they're not going to address the employment issue or wages issue in any significant manner. Do they address the question of Chinese trade policies, trade practices? I think this is a completely, silly issue because, China is never going to adopt, what the U.S. wants it to adopt in terms of its industrial and technology transfer policies. And China, frankly, has a very good reason. For the last 40 years, they've managed to engineer, the world's, most impressive poverty reduction program ever, doing things that nobody would have told them to do. So it's completely, due to their own economic policies. And the idea that, outsiders can come, or the U.S. can come and say, look, you should change your policies because, those other policies are better, and that the Chinese will say yes. I mean, it's neither here nor there. It's completely, so it's ineffective, and it's also undesirable. So going back to sort of my vision of what the right model of globalization is, it is one where basically China is largely free to do whatever it wants on its industrial policies and technology transfer policies. By the same token, the U.S. should be completely free to do whatever it wants with respect to its inward investment regime. That if you think that China, by investing domestically and by taking over U.S. corporations, is also engaged in stealing U.S. technological secrets that are important for national security or other reasons, I think the U.S. would be perfectly justified to impose very tight restrictions on those when there is genuine concern that there is national security secrets are being endangered. So I would say that basically you have to have a lot more respect for other countries' way of doing business and understand that you're not going to change it. Don't expect that there's going to be this underlying convergence in economic models. And again, this was largely what the GATT system was about. And the whole WTO system, I think, has been predicated on the notion that China would look more like the United States, and that's never going to happen, and for a good reason. So I think we need to go back a little bit more to the older conception that you need to allow room for countries to have their own regulatory arrangements and work where the spillovers are most adverse, and work on the traffic rules rather than presume that there's going to be this convergence, that China's intellectual property rights regime will converge to that in the United States, because there's no good reason that it should.
Sadly, at that point, we need to take a pause. Join me in thanking Dani for coming down and giving us a good talk.